Hello, everyone, and welcome to YPO in Davos. Thank you ever so much for both attending and viewing. This is an incredibly interesting conversation, and we've got some very interesting panelists to discuss it. My name is Paul Blanchard. I'm Managing Director of Right Angles, a reputation management business based in London, New York, and Los Angeles. Poverty has a female face. Just looking at some very quick factoids, 25% of women are in low-paid work versus 16% of men. Single parents are the family type most likely to live in poverty, and 90% of single parents are women. Low-paid women are concentrated in the 5 Cs: cleaning, cashiering, care, catering, and clerical work. 1/4 of women who have children are in poverty, compared to 17% who aren't. And 38% of low earners live in higher income households, typically as spouses of high earners. These are most often women. So poverty very much does have a female face, and I'd like our panellists to introduce themselves, set the scene, and then we'll have a discussion for what can be done about it. So if I'll start at the far right, if I may, or the far left from the screen's point
Good morning,
of view.
Paul.
If you'd like to just all introduce yourselves very briefly and do a quick scene set, and then we'll throw it up to discussion.
Sure, pleasure. Good morning to you all and all the YPO viewers. My name is Daniel Shakhani. I'm the co-founder of Salary Finance, an organisation that focuses on financial well-being within the workforce, so particularly through the employer channel. And I'm also the co-founder of the Financial Inclusion Alliance, which is a non-for-profit movement focusing on the topic of financial inclusion. The purpose of today being very much a gender equality lens is a massive topic at the World Economic Forum. I think just to set the scene to Paul's initial statistics, we know this is an issue, but we talk a lot about it from the top in terms of leadership from executives. And we know statistics like there are 7% of women who are female CEOs in the Fortune 500. And we know that there's a big shift towards now the middle management has the greatest impact of changing the direction of how employees feel about their jobs and how we can make the biggest difference in terms of their careers. But it's the bottom segment of society that I will be focusing on today, and particularly the working poor, which are 4 million people just in the UK. Within that segment, that number is much bigger in the United States, and how collaboration can be the best way to solve that problem.
Thank you, and I'm Catherine McGuinness. I'm the Policy Chair at the City of London Corporation, and that means I'm effectively the political leader of an organisation which both looks after the square mile itself, but also works with the financial and related professional services sector. And we've heard some very interesting facts already. I think from the perspective of that sector, there is a vast pool of underused, underpaid and underperforming talent. That is both not fair, but it also means that the sector is not taking advantage of some of the great talent which is out there, which could add so much to the culture of companies and to the bottom line. And I think it's also worth looking, when we look at the working poor or others excluded from the financial sector, at services and whether they're being provided sufficiently across the whole community. So I think we're going to have a good discussion this morning. Let me hand you on the mic.
Yes. My name is Sophia Swire, and I have been a social entrepreneur for 30 years now. I started off my career in the city, and I put that on hold to go out to Afghanistan and Pakistan to establish schools with a focus on girls and women. And we established about 250 of them, and we reached about 35,000 young people in the 90s. And I funded it partly through a fashion business, which was one of the first ethical fashion businesses. And I'm now establishing a Gender Lens SDG fund. And the aim is to basically give women access to capital here in Europe. When I first went to Pakistan in 1989, the rate of literacy for women in a very rural, landlocked backwater was less than 3%. And I was absolutely astounded and astonished to discover that 97% of private equity and venture capital goes to all male-founded teams. So that's really inspired me to do what I can to help successful women entrepreneurs here in the West. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks for the invitation. I'm excited to be here because this is such a critical topic. So my name is Salah Goss. I work for Mastercard. I head the Mastercard Lab for Financial Inclusion based in Nairobi. So my lens is very much one of financial inclusion and how do we do equitable growth. And so the way I would frame the problem is twofold. One of lack of access and the barriers that creates, but also one of missed opportunity. So we know that women control 80% of household spending decisions. We're on track for women to control 72 trillion in global wealth, but we're locked out of a lot of opportunities. I think this will resonate with what you said. 20% of loans, only 20% of loans go to women businesses, and there's a 300 billion credit gap for women SMEs globally. So I'm really interested in engaging the conversation to say, how do we do inclusion in a way that really takes into account the opportunity we're missing for the improvement of households because of the role women play, but also the opportunity to unlock tremendous inclusive growth if we really get it right.
And good morning. My name's Charlotte Crosswell. I'm Chief Executive of Innovate Finance. That is the fintech industry body based in the UK. And our members range from the largest banks who are looking at how they evolve their financial technology innovation all the way through to fintech companies looking to address issues like this. It's an extremely important topic for me, someone who's been a woman in the square mile for 25 years and talked about gender. I think it's time to move that dialogue forward so we don't just talk about gender as being successful as gender pay parity and looking at excodes and boards, but actually to sit there and look at this poverty gap that we've been discussing already. Our fintech companies, one of which is Salary Finance sitting at the end, are there looking to address this. And if we are to rebuild trust in our financial services sector, we have to look at how we fund women, but also how we sit there and look at the end consumer and these women who are more likely to take the home loans, who are the high payday lenders. We have to educate kids at school. We've launched Fintech for Schools program in the UK of how do we sit there and make sure that the next generation doesn't sit there and suffer from what we're going through at the moment. It's an extremely important topic for me and dear to my heart.
So the panellists have introduced themselves and they've set the scene as they see it. Clearly, there's a significant and very well-defined problem. So thank you to the panellists for that. I'll be taking some questions later on, but now for the meat of the discussion itself, and I pose a very, very broad, open question to all of the panellists. What's to be done? Catherine, perhaps we could start with you. What's to be done?
So I think there are a number of initiatives. Now, let me start with the question of jobs and access to jobs. And we've been very involved in, for example, signing up to the Women in Finance Charter, which the Treasury launched, and a number of other initiatives looking at how women can access jobs and then progress through the workforce, because there are indications that even if people get into the jobs, they're not necessarily progressing as fast as some of their peers. I have to say, inclusion is something that we're very concerned about, and not simply from the gender lens, but it does seem to us, as I said at the beginning, that there is a great pool of underused talent if we're not opening up our workforce to the brightest and best from whatever background. So, look at initiatives to ensure people can access jobs, look at how they can progress within them. But on that thorny question of how to make sure people can also access services, I will leave that to some of the others on the panel.
Would anyone else like to come in on that?
Because I think that's critical. So just stepping back a bit, when we think about financial inclusion, it's a buzzword, it's a word that we hear a lot. But what does it really mean? It means being able to participate in the economy. And what that means a lot is getting goods and services. And the base of that is ID, for example, being able to say who you are to get the services you need. And that is sorely lacking, especially for women. And so I think if we have to take an intentional gender lens to inclusion. In financial inclusion, in the work we do in Nairobi, part of the way we look at that is it's actually a benefit that the services that are critical and important are the services in sectors where women dominate. So if you talk about agriculture, if you talk about micro and small enterprise, these are places where women have an expressed financial life already, and how do we make sure they have the digital tools? So quickly we think about things like privacy, women's need for privacy, women's need for to be accommodated for lack of movement. So I can't get to a mobile money agent. How do I make money interoperable with time and space so I can stay at home if there's cultural barriers? So I think if we take a specific gender lens and think about what women need to continue to be financially active, that's a key way to address the gender gap and to also make sure that there's vital services flowing, because women can be ID'd and they can participate in the economy. So I just think, the point I'm trying to make is we have to be specific about it, and we have to look at the research and really take a human-centered human-centered approach and understand from what we've seen what women really need and want, and make that available in digital tools and in products that we develop.
It seems to me that the economy is missing out in terms of its opportunities for growth. This is a worthy initiative in and of itself, a problem that needs to be solved. But Charlotte, perhaps I could put that to you. You know, what are the practical things that we could be doing for the economy to take advantage of this underused pool of talent and resource?
And I think it throws up an interesting topic you were just discussing, you know, also around data and your ID. And certainly in the UK, it's seen as the global fintech capital. But it's important that we then share those experiences of what we've done to develop that and bringing competition and transparency into financial services and looking at the gaps where people are underfunded from banks or from services. But learn, you know, from what M-Pesa's done in Africa, what Aadhaar and India Stack's done. Because, you know, what they've done is given ID to, you know, a billion people at a time. So, you know, in the UK, we still have over 10 million people with less than £100 in their account. You know, so 2 days out of work, looking after an elderly relative, looking after children sick from school, you can put people under incredible strain. You know, it is around education. There's no doubt about it. It is a generational piece. You know, if you think, you know, not that many years ago, women weren't allowed to vote. You know, we now look that there is this ability, certainly in the Western world, to have access to those financial services, but we just have to be careful also on data as we move to AI and the data and ethics around AI. You know, some of those decisions being made in those algorithms is looking at past data. And that's going to be incredibly important as we develop these discussions going forward, is we don't just sit there and think that AI is the tool to solve this, because actually what's going to happen is it has the chance, the fourth industrial revolution, to actually bring greater inequality, because that data is going to look back. It's then not being tested. Potentially male developers as well are not testing some of the theory around that. So if we are actually to look at a more inclusive society, we also mustn't forget that we must address that going forward.
Daniel, I'll bring you in at this point. Is technology the answer here? Is innovation in terms of, we've already discussed there about women don't even have access through ID and various technical reasons. They've got a difficulty in the access. And of course, a lot of programmers are tech bros, as it were. There's a male bias in terms of the programming still. Is this something that needs to be fixed?
So I think, first of all, technology is part of the answer. It's not the total answer. That's the first thing I would say. And you touched on some of the key points here. If we look at the workforce, there's a massive amount that can be done to unlock the economic impact in our country. So this is globally, not just in the UK or the US. We know that to Charlotte's point, we know that debt is the big problem. That's the first thing we feel we need to solve, because if you can't solve the debt problem, you can't encourage people to save for their pensions and for the future. So it becomes a vicious cycle, because those people fundamentally that have mental health challenges, we know the strong linkage with money. We know that has a downward spiral, that those individuals, particularly women who are in the lower paid jobs that you alluded to at the beginning of your introduction, and 33% of those are on 0-hour contracts. So it's as a byproduct of that they are going to high-cost lenders. Those high-cost lenders we know are charging significant amounts, well over 100%, sometimes 400% or 500%, much more. That, in turn, leads to the use of the doorstep lenders, and as a result of that, the bottom line is that they can't get to work. The childcare issue is one we haven't touched on, and I would like to touch on that. Just in the UK alone, £236 is the average cost of childcare in the UK. So if you can't solve that problem, you can't even get to work in the first place. So that's kind of what's happening at the grassroots level. In terms of technology, I think there's been amazing work done by organisations like Innovate Finance, City of London Corporation and Mastercard that have really looked at solutions to the problem. So now we've talked about the broader issue from a macro perspective, but what are the solutions? We think that what we're doing through salary finance is only part of the solution. So we're providing access to affordable credit. We're collecting the loan repayments from payroll deduction. We're reporting that back to the credit bureaus, and that's leading to about an average 20% increase in the credit scores, FICO scores of those individuals. But what happens to continue in building on that financial resilience? So you have to first measure it. If we can't measure it, we can't change it. So we try to measure right at the point where we intersect with a company, to measure the impact we're having, report that back to the CEO, because it has a bottom line impact on profitability. CEO tends to care about it more. But if you can have a movement towards a pledge, a set of recommendations, which employers can embody, because fundamentally trust exists at the highest level between employer and employees, we can make a fundamental shift. So tech is part of the solution, but there's no silver bullet in my view, and true collaboration between the people on the panel and other organisations and people watching is fundamentally needed to make a systemic shift in the society.
Sophia, you're a social entrepreneur. What role does social enterprise have to play here?
Well, I would say that many of the female founders who are active are already social entrepreneurs. Women tend to care more about other people and the planet and the future for their children. So in terms of access to capital to empower female startups, I would say that encouraging investment into the social enterprise space is probably a very good way to give women access to finance.
And this is, forgive me, microphone back on now. And this is to the whole panel. What are the roadblocks then? What are the difficulties? We're all united that there's a problem, and we're clear on what needs to be done. But what's getting in our way? What's slowing down the progress to the solution that we need here? What are the roadblocks? If anyone wants to come in, please.
I think one of the main drivers is bias. Unfortunately, we still suffer from bias as humans, most of us do, whether we're conscious of it or not. And the problem with the venture capital and private equity world is, as I'm sure you know, only 8% of senior individuals on investment committees are women, and unfortunately most men are more comfortable investing in other men. Now, obviously, we've seen a big change in that in the last year. There's been a huge shift and a huge effort to really include more women on investment committees. And in America, for instance, there are about 80 venture capital companies that have popped up in the last 18 months to address access to capital for startups. But all of those women GPs are struggling to raise money from the traditional sources of finance. So again, they're facing the enormous difficulties, and one of the reasons is a lack of track record, so it's a vicious circle, so to speak. So what I'm trying to do is attract first-class GPs with a track record, highly diverse, so that we don't fall into the problem of any kind of bias. So we've got individuals of every ethnicity and religion who are already a part of our team, and in fact the name of the entity is Gender Equity Diversity Investment, short JEDI. So, yes, I believe that we can all do more, really, and those of us that are in a position to invest in startup venture capital funds should really be willing to do so, even if the track record isn't the same as a man's track record.
Charlotte?
I mean, if I can just add to that, because this is exactly the problem we've seen, in fintech. I was hoping when we moved from finance to fintech and looked at the next stage that we would see more female founders coming through, and there are female founders. There's about 17% female founders in the fintech space in the UK. But when you look at that problem they have of raising capital, it is one of the biggest issues we have. 48% of investment teams, VCs, do not have a woman on their investment committee. So the problem is the cycle just can't break. Now, I think the positive news we've seen over the last 12 months, and it's definitely accelerating, is the amount of people who are trying to address that very proactively. Not easy, trying to get a woman onto the investment committee because they don't necessarily want to join an all-male investment team. But and then bringing in founders to say, okay, you may not be ready for VC investment, but we want to sit there and nurture that, and sending that signal out. Now, that's quite a long cycle, because then you have to sit there and get the next wave of those fintech founders to come through and actually start those companies, because they're looking at it relatively put off. When you look at fintech, especially finance and tech, doesn't necessarily attract the most women. But I agree, the purpose piece, and a lot of people say there's purpose wash, but it is important that we do sit there and attract people with that purpose to come into this. But a lot of the time it does start with the banks, with the investors, and with the general community of looking at how do we actually bring that investment to female-founded businesses who are going to potentially change the world.
If I can bring Salah yourself in now, I mean, you're a senior influencer within a global financial conglomerate, if I can generalise like that. Do you feel a special sense of responsibility as a huge financial institution to play a part in this solution?
That's a great question, and I think not necessarily just as a large payments company, but in the business community. We know from lots of surveys that have been done that people want to and are having more and more trust in businesses, especially as we see some global trends around the world. So this conversation as as leaders is a really relevant one. And so I think what we do is we treat it as a business imperative. It just makes business sense to focus on women. And when you come to inclusion, back to your other question, there are real barriers that we shouldn't ignore. And they're structural. And so the same things that lock vulnerable populations from having out of financial inclusion or financial access hit women doubly. So one of the ways we look at it is what I mentioned a little bit before, is having a human-centered approach. And that's just a very fancy way of saying focus on what the customer wants and needs. And having an intentional gender lens on that is something that we do as Mastercard when we do product development. So we need to take into account the ways that women move money around or what they need when we design solutions. And that's easier said than done, right? Because you worry about scalability as a large company. You worry about reaching many people so you can be efficient, doing the right thing. But if we don't take into account what women really need, then we're missing out. So we do it in our work, but also internally at Mastercard, we realize that we need women leaders. So I'm happy to say that there are a lot of programs that focus on the next leaders. How can we get women? Representation is something you both mentioned that is key. So I think both internally and externally, we're not gonna ignore half of the power that we have, right? Whether it is getting consumers into the economy or making sure that we have leaders inside Mastercard that understand these issues. So we have representation and can speak to what our customers need. And I think that is a responsibility of the business community at large. I think we need to realize doing well by doing good is not just a slogan. It's not just something nice to say. It's a responsibility that we have, and it makes business sense. And I think part of the barrier is if we don't think about it and frame it as an opportunity, then we don't get the attention of CEOs and we don't understand that there's a real business case to focusing on women, whether it's the success they have as business owners or the consumers and people who will contribute to the economy in the future.
Catherine, I'll bring you in at this point. There has to be a role for government here, doesn't there, at all levels, national, international, and of course, regional, local.
Well, I think that's right. I think we need encouragement and incentives for people to do the right thing. We've been working with the Government Equalities Office on a programme of steps that firms can take for inclusion in the workplace, for people to be able to progress. Actually, one thing we found was that although there are particular moments that matter for women more perhaps than other parts of the workforce, if you adopt an approach which makes those moments more normal for everybody, actually that can both mean there's more buy-in and also means they work better. So in our own organisation, we're very keen on shared parental leave and making sure that it's just normal to take time for parental responsibilities. I think all of this is part of a question of winning the hearts and minds of the workforce. I think there is still a big job to be done in winning the hearts and minds of the leaders. And whether that's because of unconscious bias, whether that's because people haven't yet been convinced of the importance for the bottom line, both of an inclusive workforce, but also of services which are inclusive. I'm not sure, but what I do find promising at the moment is the increased focus from investors and customers on ESG issues and on expecting the big firms to be showing leadership, to be showing fairness. And I think that will give extra weight to initiatives such as the gender pay gap analysis. If it's clear that your customers are expecting you to be inclusive, I think that will really help.
Daniel, you're very passionate about financial inclusion, as indeed all the panel are, but you've made this stage of your career about solving that problem practically as a business.
Very much so. And I think, firstly, Catherine's comment, the role of investment world to vote with their money is one of the greatest things that I think we can start to see in sort of changing the conversation around that. So you saw Larry Fink speaking here about this issue and how they're investing specifically in companies that have the right balance from a gender equality perspective. We see Legal & General, who is one of our key shareholders in Salary Finance, acting like that, investing into society, investing into the regions across the UK to really make a difference. So I think absolutely the investment community have a big role to play, and those that are more proactive about fulfilling their role and hitting the criteria will start to see a change. From a startup community, I would say that if the startups are starting from the ground up, by definition, they can start to curate the future that they want to see. It's much easier. It's much harder for larger corporations to get that buy-in because they've built on an establishment which is hard to change. It's like turning a tanker around. So therefore, the buy-in is much harder and you have to get a lot more of the senior executives on board. And therefore, we move to this trend where when you see first movers in an industry, irrespective of what industry it is, whether it's telecoms, whether it's financial services, when you start to see movement in that, then others in their peers start to feel the pressure to make a difference. And I think that's fundamentally what we are starting to see. I think think there has been in the last 12, 18 months a fundamental sea change the way CEOs are talking about these issues more than ever. The data is proving that. If you look at the Mercer report, that's showing that absolutely we're starting to see a shift in it. So from my personal perspective, that's why I formed the Financial Inclusion Alliance. I felt that Catherine's been tremendously supportive of us, as of Mastercard and Carnes and Charlotte. And I think that's why we did it, because there were too many people focusing on it in silos. We weren't collaborating together, and we felt there was the real purpose to bring these organizations together to be able to make a difference. So we're moving to bringing together 300 now executives on the 30th of January to the City of London Corporations Guildhall. That has been a 3-year process to get to here, but building the conversation around what can be done, what data points do we have around what works, and what are the things that companies can do really to make a difference.
So I'll throw it open to questions shortly, but I'll just start with yourself, Charlotte, and then we'll go back to Daniel. I just wanted to ask all of you, before we throw it open to questions, what have we missed so far? What hasn't been discussed? What are the things that that if we ended the discussion right now, you'd leave with a sense of unease, where you think we never discussed that, we never mentioned it. So this is a chance to say, what have we overlooked so far as a panel?
I touched briefly on education. It's amazing, even in the United Kingdom, that we don't equip people with financial education at school. So actually, our curriculum hasn't really changed from my 11-year-old compared to when I was at school. And actually, what you look at that is it's shown that girls come out of school with less financial education than boys. And that's a proven stat. And so what we have to be careful of is that it's all very well addressing this as adulthood and looking at some of the solutions there, and there are some amazing solutions now available to get people out of debt or get people out into affordable credit. But we mustn't forget that there is a purpose going up to government to sit there and say, how do we actually educate this so that people come out of school understanding what a debit card is, what a mortgage is, how to save for your rent, how to save for your long-term pension. At the moment, that's not being done, and it's not being done in a lot of parts around the world either. So if we don't do that, I just worry that we've left something out there, and it's a slight disservice maybe to the kids at school.
No, I agree with you. I remember as a petulant teenager doing GCSEs that I used to tease my maths teacher saying, why am I learning about geometry and all of this? It's irrelevant. But actually, as an adult, I stand by that, although I should have been more polite at the time, because what we should have been learning about is compound interest and how mortgages work and credit cards, things that would have equipped us for that. And I mentioned this to one of my colleagues in Junior Achievement Young Enterprise recently, and he said, yes, the problem with our education system is that it teaches kids to be successful in the 1950s. It hasn't actually moved with the times. Salah.
I think maybe to take a bit of a different angle on it, what we've missed perhaps is the opportunity for framing. And what I mean by that is the framing of the question. A lot of times when we talk about gender, we talk about gaps having access, or we don't have enough women-led businesses. But I think maybe we should pose the question, why wouldn't we focus on gender? It would be like taking away half of your business opportunity. And so I think in this moment when we've proven, or we've seen research on the power of inclusion, now it's up to us to say, why wouldn't we believe that research? Why wouldn't we act on that? So what I would hope going forward, and in panels, and we spoke about, we hit on this a little bit, is saying, why wouldn't you? And what are you losing by not doing that?
Sophia.
So I would say that while there may only be 17% of female founders in the fintech space, if you broaden that out to tech-enabled companies and other companies, in the US, I believe that 44% of new businesses are being founded by women, and only a fraction of those are receiving venture capital funding. And the number of women of color who are receiving funding, or Latino women, is even lower. I mean, it's a fraction of a percent, I believe. So I would encourage people to lift their lenses and really look at business opportunities for what they are. The fact is that in the US, I believe that the population will be over half Latino within the next few years. And it's an enormous untapped business investment opportunity, really. So that's what I would say.
Catherine.
Well, I think what I would say follows on from what Charlotte said. We've been looking at what we can do for women and others, to encourage inclusion. What we haven't perhaps looked at is from the side of the women themselves, what can they do? And I think there is a huge problem which we haven't addressed around aspiration and expectation, which goes back to the really earliest age, the earliest days. There's a very good film you can find on YouTube called Redraw the Balance, and I really recommend it. And I've seen it now done for more than one country. But really, what can we do about setting those expectations from young children that they can achieve, no matter what their background, whatever their, what their gender? And I think that's a key thing we're going to need to work harder on.
Daniel, before we throw it to questions.
I think that the power of combining efforts with other countries is the biggest area I can think of, because there's so many people, we face different challenges in our lives, have dealt with the same issues at different times perhaps, but just in different geographies. And the way and the ability to be able to learn from those mistakes or those learnings in a positive way can just save us a lot of time. Our most valuable commodity is time, frankly. So if we can combine our efforts to look at this not as something that should be viewed as competitive but collaborative, and it can give us all, we rise together, we fall together, that I think changes the status quo on how we think about these issues on a global level.
Well, thank you. Right, I'd like to throw it up to questions, please, if I may. If you could ask a question, but just briefly say who you are.
Yeah. Hi, John Carr-Harris. I actually work on financial inclusion as well. So one of the questions I have is, how do you adapt cultural norms and expectations, especially in markets that financial inclusion is kind of a new concept? Particularly interested to hear about your experience perhaps in Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Kenya, if that's all right.
Who would like to come in on that?
Thank you.
Please.
It all boils down to education, I believe. When I first went out to Pakistan in 1989, the mullahs walked and marched against us. They didn't want us to set up a school that gave girls an education. We put the main mullah on the board of the school and gave his child a free education, and suddenly there were no problems. So I think it's really understanding how the culture works, and I think it's very, very important to work with the people, the local people, and get their buy-in. It's not okay for us to come as Westerners and impose our ideals and visions. But if you really work with local community organizations and listen, that's one of the key things I think that's been missing in international development, to really listen and to respect what people have to say locally, and then educate them softly. And things do change. It takes time, but cultures change.
Well, we don't have to hear from the whole panel on every question, but if anyone else wants to come in, because we can get more questions done.
Yeah. I would just only add quickly that I think that's key understanding. And then I would maybe flip it a little bit and say, how do we design products and solutions that do meet some of the norms and some of the ways that people are expressing their financial lives already? So understanding the networks that they work in, understanding the need to move money and what their needs are, I think is kind of our imperative from a product development perspective with that understanding.
Would anyone else like to come on that before we move on to the next question? Right, we had another question. Would you like to say that? Thank you.
Sure. Hi, I'm Flori Ackermer. I'm actually working for a social startup in the edtech world. So what we've seen in Austria, for example, is that there is a big challenge in terms of equality in the education space. So my question for you is, how are you working currently also with governments and regulations to change that system, or to even make it better and more relevant to the business world today?
It's a great question. Who would like to come in on that?
I can maybe talk a little bit about what we do, because we're independent of government, but we do work with them as well. It's incredibly important that industry steps up here. I think a lot of people have said to me, what's government going to do about this? And we talk about Department for Education and curriculum. Unfortunately, by the time the curriculum gets changed, guess what? The need has changed. And so, I think there is a role for big corporates, not just banks, but also the banks, to go out into the community. I've been very impressed, since I took on this role, of how many banks and corporates are doing that. So one of the banks, UK High Street banks, is covering 2/3 of schools across the country. Others choose to do a more targeted program there. And then what we do is we then let government know. So I think there's a little bit more work to be done to say, look, how do we collaborate? So we haven't got 4 banks going into the same school, because I think that confuses it. And also relatable role models. We make sure we put young women into schools. We don't send middle-aged men, white males potentially. So it's about finding the role model that's going to inspire those schools there. But we do need to coordinate that a little bit better in industry. We need to inform government what we're doing, and we have through our programme, and they're very bought into that. And I think if anything, they're looking to industry leaders to do that, because why wouldn't you want to get industry to do it? Because they're very current, and any of us can sit there and talk about what's going on now.
Catherine?
Well, I absolutely agree with Charlotte on industry engagement, and there are a number of initiatives at the moment looking at how we can all collaborate more. What I would just like to stress is I think this is a question not simply about what you do in schools, actually, but what you do in the workplace, because most of the people who are going to be in the workplace in 10 years' time are already in the workplace. And if we don't give people in the workplace access to the skills, the training, the aspiration for the jobs of tomorrow, they will be left behind. So I think progression and giving people the opportunity to reskill in the workforce and progress is really key.
Anyone on the panel want to come in before we move on? We've got time for a couple of quick questions, and then I'd like to finish. We only have 10 minutes, unfortunately, and then I'd like the panel just to have a minute or so before we go. Gentleman over there. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Michael Sterling. I think Salah's point was very interesting about being identifiable in the system. I think my concern is about the people who are unidentifiable and they deal with cash, and that's how they live day to day. I think there's people who feel part of society and those that feel out of the system. And how do we get those people out of the system, identified, and feel as if they have a stake within it? Those people don't have jobs and they live a different world. And I think while we're talking about the ones who are low income, there are some people who live day to day, bread to bread. And I'd welcome your thoughts on that. Thank you.
I was a local government elected councillor for 6 years in my former hometown of York, and it's interesting how the language is important there. So we used to use the phrase hard to reach groups, but it was very importantly and very accurately and very correctly changed, because actually that puts the burden on them to make themselves easier for us as government to reach, and we changed the description to seldom heard, which actually is the right way to do it. So I agree with you, some of the language is important as well. Of the panel, who would like to come in on that?
Maybe quickly, since it was addressed to me. I think that is key. You're right, it's not a matter of income. The way we think about it is a matter of visibility. So people are invisible, basically, and it makes them feel invisible, and they're out of the system. And how do we work to get them in the system is, I think, the right question, and they're not hard to reach. It's up to us to reach them. And one of the things that we do to tackle that, especially working with business community and government, is exactly how you started, making people understand the invisible expense and burden of cash. If you live in cash, even if you're economically active, it is quite invisible in terms of giving you access. So the proliferation of digital tools, but making sure, and digital tools I just mean a bank account, a way to move money around digitally, I think is a great start. Because the same people who feel invisible and out of the system are actually pretty active. They have financial lives they lead, they have things that are important to them. So building digital products that actually digitize what they're doing already, I think is key. A very quick example, we have a program that looks at vaccination records, and you think, what does that have to do with financial inclusion? But it's very important for parents to make sure their children are vaccinated. By digitizing that vaccination record, by giving a parent the ability to say, I am who I say I am, and I was here last week, and I'm here again to follow up with my child, gives them an on-ramp into the financial world where they were invisible before by digitizing and starting with something that really matters to them. So I think it goes back to understanding what matters to people and saying you're not invisible, and this is how we're going to actually make you show up.
Catherine.
And very briefly, I think this is a point, as you've actually just said, where local leadership, local government can play a role, because they should know their community and should be working, I think, with others, whether it's business or whether it's the education providers or whatever, looking at solutions for those people who are left behind. So I would put a big onus on the local government. Actually, on that front, in our local government capacity, we've been working with the central London boroughs on an inclusive growth strategy, because surprisingly, there are left behinds in London too. Local leadership key, I think.
Daniel, did you want to come in?
No, that's
fine. Well, I think we've got time for one more question then. I'd like to give each panellist a minute or so just to kind of sum up and make some closing remarks.
Thank you. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about, within your organizations, what are the nuances that you take into consideration when developing gender-smart or gender-specific financial products or offerings that are better tailored to meet women's needs?
Great question. Who'd like to come in on that?
I'm happy to take that first. So the statistics you touched on, the key thing is not necessarily the products you create, it's how you communicate them. So what we found interesting in our research is, back to the point about how you frame the question, it comes into play here as well. So the way you communicate and the way you talk, it will attract women to use the product or service in different ways. If you can't communicate in a way that can relate to them and make them feel important and make them feel like they're going to get value out of it, you're not even going to get the chance to talk about the actual solution and what the product is. That would be my initial comment.
Yeah, and I feel like I'm harping on the same thing. Let's call it message amplification. I think it really comes back to human-centered design and understanding what women need and want. So, women, for example, in households usually play double duty. They not only control 80% of the buying power for themselves, but they're buying for children. They're usually taking care of parents. So there's certain and specific personas as customers or someone needing financial solutions that women have. And if we don't start there with an understanding of that, then I think we've missed the boat. So it's not, there's a difference between understanding or saying how do we get women to use these products rather than the question of how do we create these products for women. And I think starting there is what we need to do.
Right, we have 5 minutes left and we have 5 panelists.
I was simply going to put in a plug for something from the insurance sector that's just come out. It's called Insuring Women's Futures, and they've identified moments of critical moments in critical moments that matter in a women's lifestyle and lifetimes, and are now proposing some solutions to how to ensure that people do take out the right insurance, do take out the right pensions, do address some of these issues. So I do recommend that, Insuring Women's Futures.
Sure. Well, as I say, you've got another minute, actually. We've got 5 panellists and 5 minutes left, so I thought I'd give each of you a minute each just to kind of make any closing remarks that you want to do. Perhaps, Charlotte, we can start with you and then work toward your right.
As I often say to big corporate boards or bank boards, it's probably unlikely that 70% of your customers are white, middle-aged and male. And so I think we have to sit there and look at that and look at those products. It's true, right? And and when you sit there and they have this sort of moment going, oh, you're quite right. And it's also that they're not going to be at the wealthiest part of society either. So we have to look at it. And I really love the question on the cash economy, because it's this huge issue. We have to find a way to give people ID. Smartphones. A lot of people have smartphones around the world that don't have a bank account. So how do we engage more with the telecoms companies or people who are already in that community? But it's absolutely essential for every company, whether it's financial services, whether it's corporates, that they are sitting there offering products to all aspects of society, all gender, all race, and look at those minorities.
Thank you. Salah?
Yeah, I guess I would just kind of echo what everyone has said and maybe just put it in 2 parts. I think to address the problem, let's first frame it as an opportunity, not a problem. But there are systemic barriers that we need to address, especially if you speak about financial inclusion. And my comments have been on the developing world, but to be clear, Mastercard thinks about financial inclusion globally, from programs we have in London to parts of the Ivory Coast where I work. And the systemic problem, one of the ones we're really trying to tackle that I mentioned before, is identification, right? And that has to be in partnership with other actors, but making sure that people show up. And so we think about it as kind of a financial ID, so I can actually be visible in the system. So there's those systemic barriers, but I think also, as I talked about before, is the product level as well. Making sure you create products that really make a difference for women and with them in mind. And just maybe to end saying, when we think about gender and financial inclusion, it hopefully it gets at some point redundant. And how could we think about inclusion without thinking about gender? Because at least half of the world is, missed when we don't. And when we think about doing well by doing good at Mastercard, we take a very practical business approach in thinking about the opportunity and the business opportunity we miss by ignoring such a vital part of the population. So I think hopefully it becomes kind of a rally cry of how could you not think about women rather than, us repeating these same statistics we've heard about the good things that happen when we do include women.
Sophia?
So I'd just like to reiterate what you've said, which is this is not about charity. It's the biggest unmet, untapped investment opportunity on the planet. The fact is that women-led businesses are more sustainable and more profitable. And especially in times of economic downturn, they're more resilient. So whilst there may be fewer unicorns, there's more steady more steady growth. And the other thing is that the future of the planet depends on our ability to have social enterprise embedded into the metrics of our core business strategies. I was astounded when I wrote to a former presidential candidate about our plans for a Female Founders Fund, and he wrote back saying, what are the Sustainable Development Goals? So whilst there have been huge steps in the right direction, I think there's an enormous amount of education still, especially with the white middle-aged elite, and also to explain that when you set up these organizations, a Gender Lens venture capital fund is not a charity, it's not philanthropy, it's a business investment opportunity. Thank you.
Yeah.
Catherine?
So business opportunity and profitability, economic sense if we're dealing with inclusion and people's problems if they're not joining in the economy, and I think fairness. I mean, clearly this is something we need to get on with, look at the solutions which are working, work together to make things work even better. I think it's been a great discussion this morning. Thank you.
And just by sheer accident of seat placement, we're going to give the last word on female financial inclusion to a man. Daniel.
So number one is scaling impact at scale. So scaling things that really make a difference would be high on my agenda. Two is using this as a way to create an economic advantage in companies. So we know that people who can help through the employers can drive stronger retention. And that's a reason why you should work for certain companies. So how do you make this such a positive that people are attracted to work with certain brands or work for certain companies? And the last thing I would add is a central repository where people can go to find ideas for companies or for startup businesses. So if there was a central clearinghouse, which I do see an opportunity as we turn into a new decade, to have a single place where people can go to that's endorsed by government and other stakeholders, where people can say these are vetted, these are ideas or solutions that could be used by society, be that companies or who else. I think that's a really powerful way for us to think about how we can make a difference and just save people a lot of time to get to the right answers.
Well, I'm sure we'd all agree, the audience here and those watching on YouTube, that was a hugely interesting and enlightening and very solutions-focused conversation. So I hope you join with me in giving a round of applause for our panel to thank them for the time.